In August of 1776, just weeks after declaring independence, the United States was about to face its first major test. The British had assembled one of the largest military forces ever seen in North America, and their target was New York City. Standing in their way was George Washington and a largely inexperienced American army. What followed here in Brooklyn would become the largest battle of the American Revolution, a devastating American defeat that left Washington's army trapped against the East River. But over the next few days, Washington would make a series of decisions that helped save his army and possibly the revolution itself. This is Washington's Retreat, and over this series, we're going to follow the story through the streets of modern-day Brooklyn Heights, visiting the places where it actually happened. Our story begins with one of the men who helped set the revolution in motion, Philip Livingston. Before the American Revolution turned Brooklyn into a battlefield, Brooklyn looked very different. Much of this neighborhood was farmland and country estates owned by some of New York's wealthiest families, and one of those estates belonged to Philip Livingston, a future signer of the Declaration of Independence. Livingston came from one of colonial New York's most powerful families, and he would become a successful merchant and an important figure in New York politics. Although his primary residence was in Manhattan, Livingston also owned a country estate here in Brooklyn. The property was known for its extensive gardens, and Garden Place, the street we're standing on today, takes its name from those gardens. But as tensions between the colonials and Great Britain grew, Livingston found himself at the center of a much bigger story. In July 1775, Livingston joined other members of Congress in signing the Olive Branch Petition, essentially one final attempt to reconcile with Great Britain. The colonists affirmed their loyalty to King George III while asking the Crown to address their grievances and prevent the conflict from becoming a full-scale war. The king refused it and instead declared the colonies to be an open rebellion. Less than a year later, reconciliation was essentially dead. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, and Philip Livingston became one of 4 delegates from New York to sign it. And then, just weeks later, the revolution arrived practically at his front door. In August of 1776, one of the largest British forces ever assembled arrived in New York, and Brooklyn became the site of the first major campaign following the Declaration of Independence. Livingston and other prominent patriots were forced to flee. His New York City home, as well as his Brooklyn estate, were taken over by the British. Livingston would never get to see the country he helped create win its independence. He continued serving in the Continental Congress until June 1778, when he died suddenly in York, Pennsylvania, at just 62 years old. Today, Livingston's Brooklyn estate is long gone. The gardens have disappeared and the neighborhood has been completely transformed, but one small piece of it survives: Garden Place, a street name that still connects Brooklyn to Philip Livingston and to the summer when the American Revolution came directly to this neighborhood. Washington has just forced the British out of Boston, but he knows they're coming back. And one of the most obvious places for them to strike next is New York. New York has a massive harbor, sits at the mouth of the Hudson River, and if the British can control it, they would potentially cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. So in April of 1776, Washington arrives in New York and starts preparing for the invasion. He looks across the East River and sees a major problem: the high bluffs of Brooklyn. If the British control these heights, they'll have a commanding position overlooking the river and the city. So Washington sends troops into Brooklyn to start building defenses, including one right here, Fort Half Moon. Now, this wasn't a giant stone fortress. This was mostly an earthwork. Soldiers dug trenches, piled up dirt to form defensive walls, and positioned cannons overlooking the East River. Its curved, crescent-shaped defenses are what gave Fort Half Moon its name. There were plans to expand it with a much larger fortification called the Congress, but those plans were never realized. When the Battle of Brooklyn begins on August 27th, the worst of the fighting happens further away from here, but the Americans are eventually driven back toward their defenses in what is today Brooklyn Heights. The British would take Brooklyn, build their own fort nearby, and Fort Half Moon fades into a secondary role. But in 1776, this bluff was part of Washington's desperate attempt to turn Brooklyn into a barrier protecting New York. At our next stop, Washington would watch his army being crushed in the Battle of Brooklyn. What he saw there would help set in motion one of the most important decisions of the entire war. Today, this is the corner of Atlantic Avenue and Court Street, home to a Trader Joe's, but in 1776, you'd be standing at the base of a massive hill with an American fort sitting on top of it. This was Cobble Hill Fort, also known as Fort Corkscrew, named for the trenches that spiraled their way up the hillside. From the top, George Washington had a front row seat to one of the worst disasters of the American Revolution. On August 27, 1776, the British outmaneuvered Washington's army during the Battle of Brooklyn. American soldiers were desperately retreating back toward the defenses of what is today Brooklyn Heights, while another force was nearly trapped in the Gowanus Marshes. To give their fellow soldiers time to escape, a small group of Maryland troops repeatedly charged a much larger British force near what we now call the Old Stone House. They became known as the Maryland 400. Their sacrifice helped hundreds of American soldiers escape, but Washington now had an even bigger problem. His army was trapped in Brooklyn, the British were closing in from the land, the Royal Navy controlled the waters, and behind them was the East River. Washington had just 2 days to figure out how to save his army. Welcome to the Fort Chinley's house, Washington's headquarters during the Battle of Brooklyn. Washington has just suffered the worst defeat of the war effort thus far. Thousands of British troops are closing in. The East River is behind him and his army is trapped in Brooklyn. So Washington has a decision to make: stay and fight or somehow escape. So on August 29th, Washington and his officers met here and made a remarkable decision. They were abandoning Brooklyn. But now they had to secretly move thousands of soldiers, horses, artillery, and supplies across the East River, right under the noses of the British. Washington caught two incredible breaks that made this possible. First, the winds kept British warships from moving into the East River, and second, as morning approached with Americans still waiting to escape, a thick fog rolled in and concealed them from the British. Boat after boat crossed the river, and by the morning of August 30th, Washington's army was gone. The British had captured Brooklyn, but they'd failed to capture Washington's army, and Washington had learned a lesson that would help define the rest of the war. He didn't have to hold every city, he didn't have to win every battle. He had to keep his army alive. The American Revolution may have been over in Brooklyn, but the British weren't going anywhere. After Washington evacuated his army across the East River, Brooklyn entered nearly 7 years of British occupation, and by 1780, the British were turning this spot into one of the largest fortifications in Brooklyn, Brooklyn Fort. Today, there's a courthouse standing here, and that actually gives you a pretty good idea of just how massive this fort was. It stretched roughly 400 feet on each side, with high walls, artillery, and heavy defenses sitting on top of a rise known as Clover Hill. And remember, Brooklyn looked completely different back then. No apartment buildings, no office towers. From this hill, British soldiers could look out across the countryside, watch the roads approaching Brooklyn, and help keep New York Harbor. But here's the interesting part. Brooklyn Fort actually outlived the Revolution. The British evacuated New York in 1783, but the fort remained here for decades. As Brooklyn began growing into a city, residents actually started tearing pieces of it down, only to be told to stop because the land belonged to the federal government. Eventually, development won, and by the 1820s, the fort had disappeared. Clover Hill was reshaped, and Brooklyn grew up around it. The Battle of Brooklyn had been a devastating defeat. Washington had been outmaneuvered, hundreds of his men had been killed or captured, and the British would soon take control of New York. But Washington had saved the one thing he could not afford to lose: his army. The revolution would continue for another 7 years. Washington would suffer more defeats, retreat from New York, cross New Jersey, and eventually lead that same army to victory. And that's what makes the story of Washington's retreat so important. The Americans didn't win the Battle of Brooklyn, they survived it. And sometimes surviving long enough to fight another day can change history. Until next time, thanks for joining me.